When Dark Souls 1 first released back in late 2011, I wasn't a fan, because it was too hard, at least compared to what I was used to at the time. However, just as I documented in my retrospective of the game, it had cast a spell on me, and thus, a year or so later, I'd end up giving it another shot, leading to the most impactful gaming experience of my life, one which actually altered my taste in games and left me wanting more. Then, 2.5 years later, Dark Souls 2 would come out, of course sharing most of the same gameplay elements as the first game, but with a rather different feel and tone and reception. Dark Souls 2 remains the most controversial of FromSoft's modern titles, and though my own opinions on that game have shifted a fair bit over the past 9 years, back when it first came out, I loved it. It was more Dark Souls. Call it Dark Souls, put it on a plate, and I'd put it in my mouth and suck. Then, just 3 months after the second game had even came out, FromSoft's new project was announced, and it wasn't Dark Souls 3, it was Bloodborne. I've played and finished every Soulsborne game many times, and I love them all. Well, kinda. Being the ripe old age of 30 now, it can be pretty difficult for me to get excited about any new games these days, and really, no bloody wonder, most games suck. But despite my cynicism here, a new FromSoft release rarely fails to get me hyped, and rightly so, because they consistently deliver some of the highest quality gaming experiences you can have. I love Dark Souls, I love Elden Ring, I love Sekiro, but folks, I really love Bloodborne. It's my favourite FromSoft game, and probably my second favourite game of all time. To be honest, the only reason I haven't done a video before now on it was because I just didn't know how to record gameplay footage on the PS5, but then I actually looked up how to do it and it turns out it's the easiest thing in the world. So here we are, finally. In a bold departure from the dark fantasy of Dark Souls, Bloodborne would enter into the darker world of horror, replacing demons with beasts, bows with guns, knights with hunters, and castles with... well, actually there is a castle in Bloodborne too. Although the trailers showed blood, beasts and frenzied villagers, giving off vague echoes of Resident Evil 4, there would end up being much more to the game's themes, with the surface horror elements of werewolves and mad doctors and such, masking the more compelling, cosmic and eldritch themes found deeper within and higher above. This was all back in 2014, 2015 too, when Lovecraft-themed games were actually quite rare and people still got excited about the prospect of a new one, as opposed to now where every third indie title released is Lovecraft-influenced in some way. Not dissimilar to how everyone used to get all hyped at the prospect of a new Souls-like, compared to now where every third game is a Souls-like. Gameplay wise, compared to the relatively slow, methodical pace of Dark Souls 1 than the even slower pace of Dark Souls 2, Bloodborne would ramp the speed of everything way up, from the attacking to the dodging to even the healing. The new combat system would be fast, frantic and very bloody. Nonetheless, Souls fans would certainly not be alienated by the new feel of combat, with the game still holding true to the same quality and principles found in the 3 prior Souls games, such as excellent level design, difficulty, tight combat mechanics and compelling lore. A new term was even coined to encompass Bloodborne into the family of FromSoft's modern titles, Soulsborne, though the later release of Sekiro complicated this a bit when some people started throwing around Soulsborne Kiro, before people gave up entirely with the naming convention upon the release of Elden Ring. That being said, I will still use the term Soulsborne from time to time throughout this video to refer to the whole catalogue of modern FromSoft games. I remember the day before Bloodborne's release date. I was living in a flat with a couple of friends at the time, hyped as hell for the next day when I'd finally get to play it, only for the very game to emerge from through my letterbox before falling gently onto the doormat. It had arrived a day early. The same thing would later happen with Elden Ring too, and speaking of Elden Ring, please watch my video on it. I promise it doesn't suck. But then I would say that, wouldn't I? I was excited as hell to get the game installed and get playing it, and by the time I'd finished it the next week, I realised that Bloodborne was one of those rare, special cases of being completely hyped for something only for it to come out and be even better than you could ever have hoped. Folks, let's get into it. Let's talk Bloodborne. Quick word about what to expect from the structure of this video. I'll first begin with an introduction into the world and lore of Bloodborne before discussing the game's many levels and bosses throughout our hunter's journey, bringing up interesting nuggets of lore and background where appropriate. And I'll also provide analysis and critique of the game's many gameplay elements and mechanics throughout the video. Let me stress, by the way, that for as much as I love Bloodborne's lore, I'm really not a lore expert, so please don't expect any groundbreaking theories or novel interpretations from me here, because it's just not my thing. And lastly, if you like what you see and hear in this video, I'd be real appreciative if you can give it a like, and maybe even subscribe if you really like it. Many thanks. Although every other modern FromSoft title starts out with a sequence to give the player at least some sort of introduction and explanation of the game world, Bloodborne kinda doesn't. Yes, there is a cutscene where we're given a contract so as to choose a starting class, followed by a blood-soaked werewolf climbing up onto our gurney before going up in flames, followed by whatever the hell's happening here. But these scenes only serve to leave the player more baffled than they were before, and even though I've finished Bloodborne about 20 times, I still don't quite understand what's happening here. But at least after the opening scenes of Dark Souls, Sekiro and Elden Ring, I had some sort of idea of what I was getting into. This isn't intended as a critique, by the way, just an observation, and I think it's actually really effective in quickly establishing a tone of weird, inexplicable horror. Bloodborne is set in Yharnam, a dark gothic city of madness, blood and beasts. Yharnam is the home of an institution known as the Healing Church, a powerful and influential organisation who provide and control a process called blood ministration, ostensibly a miracle of medicine capable of curing ailments which cannot be cured through conventional means. Blood is the lifeblood of the city of Yharnam, and as well as it being used for healing, even otherwise healthy Yharnamites are known to indulge in it in preference over alcohol due to it being more intoxicating. However, all this blood ministration and intoxication is not at all without its risks, because as we very quickly see, Yharnam is overrun with beasts, and our character, a foreigner to Yharnam, has arrived at the worst possible time, because this is a night of the hunt, and beasts now roam the streets. One of the branches of the Healing Church is that of the Hunters, and the role of Hunters is to fight back against the scourge of beasts whenever an outbreak occurs. It's not known how many outbreaks there have been in Yharnam's history, or exactly how severe they tend to be, but one thing is for sure, this particular night is the worst it's ever been, to the extent that Yharnamites can be seen prowling the streets partway through their beastly transformations, and there are almost no more normal humans left, and even other hunters have gone blood drunk, attacking the player on sight.
Yharnam's done for, tell ya.
The cause of all this is blood, hence the name Bloodborne, and the Healing Church is to blame for its normalisation of blood ministration, not to mention consumption. The blood itself isn't from any person or animal either, but rather it was originally discovered by scholars from the school of Byrgenwerth within the tomb of the gods below Yharnam, and the dark eldritch origins of the old blood within the tombs are the root of this dreadful scourge of beasts. As for our own hunter, we are a foreigner, and that's about the only thing we know about our past. As for why we've came to Yharnam in the first place, that is never covered in-game, but a reasonable assumption is that we're here to receive a cure for some illness, hence the blood transfusion at the very beginning. Near the start of the game, we encounter another outsider named Gilbert, who himself came to Yharnam for a chance at survival from some ambiguous ailment, and the church's blood healing did help buy him some time, though ultimately, things don't turn out so great for him. Due to us being an outsider, we first need a contract. As we'll soon see, Yharnamites detest outsiders, and this is primarily because rather than the Healing Church taking responsibility for the scourge of beasts, they instead blame it all on foreigners and outsiders. Thus, we have several unpleasant interactions with irate citizens shut within their houses who aren't too pleased at our presence at their doorsteps, and whilst in combat, you'll frequently hear the beastly townfolk shout things like, "You are not wanted here!" And while I used to think they were saying this to us because we're a hunter, no, it's actually because we're an outsider, and Yharnamites hate outsiders. But back to our contract, this is where we choose our starting class. Now, one area where Bloodborne is somewhat toned down compared to Dark Souls is in build variety. For example, there are far less weapons in this game compared to Dark Souls. There are only 6 stats, options for ranged builds are quite limited, though still viable to some degree, and there's also never an option to reallocate your stats. If you want to try out a different build in the middle of a playthrough or a New Game Plus, you just can't. Gotta start a new game. Because of this, a quality build with an equal emphasis on both strength and skill is never a bad idea for a playthrough, making most of the game's weapons available to you and with enough scaling potential to make them viable. Blood Tinge is quite an interesting stat though, because unlike the others, it really doesn't have an equivalent stat in Dark Souls or Elden Ring, and instead is what determines the strength of firearms, though it does also play a part in a few special weapons too. I've tried a Blood Tinge build before, and while it starts off pretty weak due to the limited ability for firearms to serve as primary damage dealers, it can end up being one of the most powerful builds in the game after getting your hands on the Chikage weapon. As for Arcane, it works just like Luck from Dark Souls 3 or Arcane from Elden Ring, primarily determining item discovery but also coming into play for some weapons and special items. Like I said earlier, Bloodborne doesn't have magic as such, but there are still some interesting options for ranged damage which do kinda resemble magic, in a way. Something which I found hilarious was that it took all of 5 seconds of me getting control of the game to accidentally trigger a gesture. Unlike in FromSoft's other games, gestures are motion controlled in Bloodborne, triggered by holding down X and moving your controller in a certain way, and furthermore, you cannot turn this off. This is a horrible, horrible idea and they shouldn't have done it. Why did they do this? The X button happens to be the button used to open doors, pull levers and pick up items too, so it's really not that uncommon to accidentally trigger a gesture when performing one of these actions, or even to die after performing a gesture in the heat of battle due to the fact that you cannot quickly cancel out of them. Also, it seems to get accidentally triggered more frequently with a PS5 controller than a PS4 one for whatever reason, or maybe I'm just imagining that. For anyone thinking I'm being overly harsh here, let me clarify the gesture controls are one of the very few things I don't like about the game, and they're more of a nitpick than anything. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's move onwards and upwards. After getting to grips with the controls a wee bit and moving onwards through the clinic where we've awoke, we come face to face with our first beast, feeding on the corpse of a Yharnamite who has himself begun the transition to beasthood. And this is where most people will see a swift death, as is FromSoft's tutorial level tradition. It is actually pretty easy to kill this thing, even without yet having any weapons though, because the unarmed charge attack happens to be the fastest in the game, staggering the enemy if they're hit from behind and allowing for a high damage critical. Even much later on, once you get a weapon, it can be a really effective tactic to switch to bare hands for a fast charge attack just to take advantage of the follow-up critical, with the strength of criticals primarily being determined by your skill stat and level. Also, a nugget of useless information here is that if you take out this particular beast, it's one of the only regular enemies in the game that will never respawn after being killed. Regardless of whether you die here or make it to the Hunter's Lamp at the top of the ladder, the outcome is the same. You awake in the Hunter's Dream. This is Bloodborne's hub area and possible contender for best Soulsborne hub area, though Majula is also a serious contender for that position. Being a hub area, this is where you'll do all your leveling up, shopping, weapon upgrading and more, and speaking of weapons, we finally get to choose a couple. I've used all 3 starting options here extensively over different playthroughs and they're all great, though the Saw Cleaver in particular is considered by many to be one of the best weapons in the game and all you'll actually need from beginning to end, hence why this is the weapon you'll see almost exclusively in the vast majority of Bloodborne speedruns out there. Though for everyone else, there are a bunch of other interesting and brutal weapons on offer, particularly within the DLC, which did well to address some folks' complaints that the vanilla game did not have enough weapon variety. I decided to buck the Saw Cleaver trend myself and opt for the Hunter's Axe, another great weapon with a wonderful sweeping ability, though I'd experiment a bunch with other tools of the hunt throughout my playthrough. As well as a primary weapon, we get to choose a firearm, and the constant presence of a gun is key to making Bloodborne's combat feel so thrilling and distinctive. An important character we meet in the Hunter's Dream is Gehrman, the wheelchair-bound first hunter, now turned hunter's helper. The Hunter's Dream itself is a very mysterious place, clearly being located in some different plane of reality from the real world, as indicated by the multitude of bizarre pillars arranged in the distance, a motif that appears in several other FromSoft games too. Whereas we as hunters can travel to and from the Hunter's Dream, Gehrman is bound to this place, and with him being known as the first hunter, who knows how long he's been here for. In fact, upon this introduction, he initially struggles to recall even his own name. Gehrman will give the player some light advice and guidance throughout the first several hours of the game, though to be honest, he doesn't really stick around for all that long. At a certain point through the game, he'll just disappear entirely before you see him again at the very end, which I always found a little bit off-putting. What's even more off-putting, though, is this line of dialogue.
You're welcome to use whatever you find. Even the dog, should it please you.
Is he telling me I can fuck the doll? Joking aside, this isn't what he actually means, but it's just funnier to imagine it that way, especially the way his voice goes all hushed, as if he's saying something shameful. The doll in question is merely that at first, an abandoned, motionless doll, though later on, after the player gains at least one insight, the doll gains sentience and serves as the means to allow the player to level up. Once the player is up and ready to leave the Hunter's Dream and venture back out into the waking world though, you can teleport back to Yharnam via one of these headstones, and this method of warping from location to location is one aspect of the game that I've never been all that hot on. See, in the other games, you sit at a bonfire, sculptor's idol or point of grace, healing you up, protecting you from enemies, resetting all the enemies in the area and allowing you to warp to other such safe havens. But the Hunter's Lamps in Bloodborne don't work like that. Instead, all you can actually do from them is warp back to the Hunter's Dream, and then from there warp elsewhere back to the real world, adding a somewhat unnecessary step in between compared to just allowing the player to warp directly to other Hunter's Lamps from any other Hunter's Lamp. This can get particularly tedious if you're out doing a bit of blood echo or blood vial farming and have to sit through multiple load screens each time just to be able to reset the enemies in the area, and even more tedious when you take into account the game's rather long loading times, even on PS5, though anyone who got this game on release will remember that the original loading times were way worse. Not to mention that the loading screen used to just be a still image of the word Bloodborne before they implemented a well-needed patch. But finally we are free to rain terror to the beast scourge stalking the streets of Yharnam. The game really doesn't start you off too gently either, and the first section of the city can be brutal for first time players, throwing hordes of Yharnamites at you, many of them in various stages of beasthood, some still being fully anthropomorphic and clothed but with thick hair sprouting from all over their bodies, others with one or more grotesquely elongated arms from which they hold various crude weaponry, and others still which have fully transitioned into their beast forms, with the only remnants of their former humanity being the bloodstained tatters of clothing clinging to their filthy fur. An outstanding aspect of Bloodborne which immediately hits you upon stepping out into Yharnam is its distinctive atmosphere of horror and madness. Even the very structure of the city itself and its cramped architecture and ominous Gothic spires which stand out against the scarlet skyline create this unnerving, overbearing feeling of oppression, especially when coupled with the brutal gangs of Yharnamites stalking the city streets in search of outsiders to butcher. As is the case with most of Yharnam's inhabitants, their minds have completely snapped, and they'll shout out and call the player a beast in broken ignorance of their own monstrous transformations. Bloodborne has insane enemy variety, especially when taking the Chalice Dungeons into account, but these regular Yharnamites are by far my favourite, thanks to their frantic lines of dialogue when attacking, and upon dying. So quotable too. Some things I'll just be sitting in the house by myself, and then the words, "You are not wanted here!" will pop out of my mouth before I even know what's happened. Perhaps I should seek help. Incredibly strong opening area and a perfect introduction to what the game offers, and like I said, it really throws you into the deep end and forces you to quickly get to grips with the faster pace of combat due to the enemy's ferocious and high damage combos, not to mention the sheer bloody number of enemies here. This spot where the werewolf is burning at the stake can be brutal as the game hits you full in the face with what to expect from its combat, and even with me being a Souls veteran back then, this part still kicked my arse several times before I got through it. It's not even that difficult, and certainly not when compared to many later sections, but rather it's there to get you acclimated to the nature and speed of the game's combat in one early focused dose. Whereas hanging back and playing defensively behind a shield or by simply barraging the enemy with sorcery, pyromancy, miracles, hexes or incantations is a totally viable and legitimate way to play the Souls games in Elden Ring, it is most certainly not legit when it comes to Bloodborne's combat. The new focus is on aggression, not quite to the same extent as in Sekiro, but certainly more so than the other Soulsborne games. Several new gameplay aspects all encourage player aggression, such as the lack of a shield, the lack of effective armour, and the rally mechanic. Now, there technically is a shield, but to be honest it's shit and no one uses it. I guess there's also the lock shield way later on in the game, in the DLC, but from what I understand it's nearly useless for blocking physical damage. As for the lack of armour, there is still fashion souls here, and in fact the range of apparel on offer here has never been so sleek and elegant, but I've always found the extent to which clothing sets actually prevent damage to be quite limited. And I've never really noticed a significant difference in defensive quality from one set of clothing to the next, and you certainly won't be finding any equivalent of Havel's armour here. Thus, I always just choose clothing that looks the coolest, which happens to apply to most of Bloodborne's clothing options, and you even unlock more gear for purchase after defeating certain enemies like the Keeper of the Old Lords, Father Gascoigne and Hemwick. As for the rally mechanic, when you take damage in Bloodborne, the amount of health you've just lost will remain highlighted within your health bar for several seconds after getting hit, and retaliating back against that enemy or any other enemies during those several seconds will gradually replenish your lost health, with the potential to restore it all the way back to full, and you can even throw in a couple of extra hits on a dying enemy to continue gaining health back. Bloodborne is a hard fucking game, and you're going to get hit a lot. I don't think it's the hardest Soulsborne game, because personally I think that accolade belongs to either Sekiro or maybe even Elden Ring. Fuck you, Malekith. But in Bloodborne, taking damage and lots of it is just part of the game. However, the game also counters this in your favour with the inclusion of the rally mechanic, as well as the fact that right from the very start of the game you can carry up to 20 blood vials at a time, or even 32 blood vials with the right rune setup later on, not to mention that healing is faster here than in any other Soulsborne game. Thus, although the speed of combat and enemy aggression has been greatly accelerated here, it also provides you with a much higher capacity for health recovery, encouraging the player to stay right there in the action after getting hit, instead of trying to panic roll away to safety. Speaking of rolling, it's mostly been replaced by a swift new dash, although you can still roll when not locked onto an enemy. But gone are the days of mid rolls or fat rolls, because equip load has also been done away with, regardless of which set you're wearing or the size and heft of your trick weapon. I haven't forgotten about trick weapons, by the way, and I'll talk about those later. They're sick. The stamina consumption of dashes compared to the rolls from Dark Souls is also way less, and that's a good thing too, because you're going to need to do a lot of dashing to deal with all those crazy combos thrown at you from both bosses and regular enemies. Extended combos would of course become commonplace in Dark Souls 3, Sekiro and Elden Ring, but that was not so much the case with the first 3 Souls titles due to their slower, heavier feel, and Bloodborne really set the wheels in motion for the acceleration of the Soulsborne formula for several games to come. There's a couple of directions to head for at the start, and depending on where you go, your first boss will be different. I always go straight for the big bridge, though I guess the 2 werewolves hanging around here can act as a pretty effective deterrent, making some players think, oh, this must be one of those situations where I should come back later and kill these things, though you can make good use of Molotovs, or if you're really cheap, attack from within the doorway where they cannot get to you. At the end of the bridge though is the Cleric Beast, the same creature we first heard back when climbing the ladder to the first Hunter's Lamp, though this boss is actually completely optional. It can be pretty freaking hard too, and it has a lot of health, though thankfully so do we thanks to our 20 blood vials. The Cleric Beast is a challenging encounter, but you certainly do have tricks and tools to make it less painful, one of which are Molotovs, the effectiveness of which can be enhanced by first throwing an oil on, or you can shoot the beast's head to stagger it, allowing for a critical attack. Those tactics will only go so far though before you simply need to get to grips with its punches, slams and grabs. The reason it's called a Cleric Beast is because while we've already seen all manner of beasts and madmen by this point, it would end up being the members of the Healing Church itself who would go on to transform into the largest and most grotesque of beasts. Soulsborne games are generally some of the best in the industry when it comes to delivering that satisfying, rewarding pop after beating a boss, coupled with a big soul reward and maybe a boss soul, but I think Bloodborne has them all beat when the words "Prey Slaughtered" appear in bold, followed by the boss arena literally raining with the blood of your enemy. Though being the Cleric Beast does not progress the story forward or unlock access to other areas, it does get you the Sword Hunter badge, unlocking more weapons and items for purchase at the shop in the Hunter's Dream. And now that we have some insight, the doll is alive and kicking, allowing us to level up for the first time. Although she's sentient now though, if you do come back to the Hunter's Dream with 0 insight, a nice touch is that she'll be transformed back into a regular doll again until you get some more. Insight is both an interesting and thematically appropriate resource in this game, and you get it from entering boss arenas, beating bosses, entering certain strange and secretive locations, and also by using certain items. Although insight can just be thought of as another resource, it also alters certain characteristics of particular levels and enemies depending on how much insight you have at that time. There really aren't all that many aspects which can be affected by it, and furthermore the game gives 0 indication of how much insight is even required to trigger certain thresholds, but what do you expect, it's FromSoft. A classic example is in the optional area Hemwick Charnel Lane, where these shadowy Mad One creatures will only appear if you have at least 15 insight, and in fact the area boss just further ahead can be totally trivialised, because if you go in with 0 insight, then the aforementioned Mad One enemies that are normally spawned in there too just won't show up at all. Another example is outside the chapel in the Cathedral ward, where having an insight of at least 40 will make a terrifying amygdala creature fully visible, whereas normally these eldritch oddities will be completely invisible. They're always present here though, even if you can't see them, as evidenced by this attack which seems to come out of nowhere when you first come here. There are a number of other insight effects too, and a really cool aspect of them is that they never make the game easier. As I mentioned, this is thematically appropriate, because the insight counter is supposed to represent the player's level of eldritch knowledge of the world, hence why it grows every time you see or beat some new boss monstrosity or enter a forbidden area, and thus, as your hunter's understanding of the world grows, they gradually start to discern all its true, terrifying realities and suffer for it, rather than gaining strength through their insight, and I think that's a beautiful implementation of a game mechanic. I certainly do think it could have been handled better though. I mean, due to the various negative effects that insight has, such as making some enemies do more damage and increasing the player's vulnerability to the frenzy mechanic, in theory it would be best to maintain a fairly low number of insight and spend it on consumables and materials in the Hunter's Dream before it gets too high. In reality though, insight really doesn't have as much of an effect on gameplay as it could have. Yes, there's some cool effects here and there, but not many, and I wish they'd have done more with it. The possibilities could have been endless. For example, the Mad One enemies which appear in Hemwick, that's a great idea, but that's the one and only time this is done, which is just a bit odd. Why not have additional enemies spawn in other places too? Also, to my knowledge, they didn't include a single insight dependent aspect in the DLC, showing that its implementation is anything other than an additional purchasing resource, sadly a bit half-baked. A very cool and easily missable touch with the icons for the Madman's Insight and Great One's Wisdom consumables, which are used to gain insight, is that they depict these luminescent slug-like creatures called phantasms within human skulls. And although phantasms are an easy element to overlook in general when it comes to Bloodborne's lore, they're also a fundamentally significant part of it, and they'll reappear several more times throughout the game, especially in the DLC. Travelling the other direction from the Cleric Beast will instead lead you down into Yharnam's sewers, past more wolfmen, as well as other varieties of monster entirely, like these disgusting sewer corpses with their legs rotted off, not to mention the man-eater boar at the far end of this tunnel. See, back when I first saw the early trailers and promotional images for Bloodborne, I assumed the horror themes would be somewhat conventional, with people transforming into wolves and all manner of other hairy beasts. And I even remember being a bit disappointed at the prospect of a new FromSoft game primarily being set in a city environment with guns and stuff, assuming that the more grounded levels might be less interesting than places like Darkroot Basin or the Dragon Eyrie from the Dark Souls games. But no. Bloodborne gets really weird and interesting really quickly, and any disappointed notions of more grounded levels are done away with after only a few minutes of playing the game. You fight all sorts of weird enemies here and explore a great variety of interesting locations, particularly in the various nightmare levels later on in the game and especially in the DLC. I will of course cover the Oath Hunters DLC extensively later on in the video, but for now, suffice to say that it's the best DLC I have ever played. At the other end of the sewer, just before the next boss, we emerge back up into Yharnam and at the top of a large set of steps. I'm not going to be doing a play-by-play of every occurrence and action in the game, by the way, but I did just want to highlight this part because every time I've emerged from the top of the ladder on any playthrough, the brick troll at the top always hits the boulder, which always damages the troll itself before rolling down and killing a bunch of enemies further down the steps. I like that this happens because as a player it helps me, plus it's mildly amusing. But why does it happen? Anyway, just further on, the proper boss of Central Yharnam awaits. Father Gascoigne with his legendary intro cutscene.
Beasts all over the shop. You'll be one of them, sooner or later.
Such great voice acting, though his dialogue once he loses about 30% of his HP is even better.
What's that smell? The sweet blood. Oh, it sings to me. It's enough to make a man sick.
Although the Cleric beast is certainly a challenge, it is rather conventional in a sense, essentially being a big monster with well telegraphed moves and combos. Gascoigne is very different though, being a hunter just like us, and even using our same weapon, the hunter axe. As such, he poses a different sort of challenge, and while you can simply learn his attacks and dodge timings, this is a great time to really get to grips with one of Bloodborne's most enjoyable combat mechanics, the Stagger. See, we picked up a firearm at the start of the game, and there are in fact a bunch of different firearms later, from modest pistols all the way to roaring cannons and Gatling guns. However, whilst guns can be used to deal some damage, with the damage potential increasing depending on your blood tinge stat, it's really not an optimal way to play the game for multiple reasons. 1. A significant investment into the blood tinge stat is required to start doing remotely decent damage. 2. Firing your gun requires quicksilver bullets, of which a starting max of just 20 can be carried at the one time, though this can be upgraded with runes or by sacrificing a chunk of health for 5 temporary blood bullets. However, with weapons like cannons consuming 12 bullets at a time, this can be of limited usefulness. And 3. Developing a build around attacking enemies from a distance with guns isn't even close to being an optimal way to play the game. You have to force it. The true role of firearms in combat is the Stagger, Bloodborne's answer to parrying. When an enemy is at the tail end of an attack animation, hitting them with your gun will stagger them, leaving them completely vulnerable to dash in for a critical hit. This works on the vast majority of enemies for the vast majority of their attacks, and even works on several bosses. Whilst I said Stagger is Bloodborne's answer to parrying, it's actually much safer, because for parrying to work in Dark Souls, you need to be close enough for the enemy's attack to actually connect. Otherwise, the enemy attack will miss, and of course the parry. But in Bloodborne, as long as an enemy is within range of your bullets, you can stagger their attack as long as your timing is right, even if they're out of range of you. The timing part can be easier said than done though, and it can take a certain amount of experimentation and dying before you figure out the stagger window, but really, the same can be said of dodging. With some enemy attacks, you need to wait a second and a half after the startup animation even begins before firing, whereas other enemy attacks might come out just about faster than you can even fire. Because bear in mind that firing your gun is not instantaneous and has its own startup animation, compared to your dodge, which is comparatively quicker to perform. To me, the Hunter's pistol always seemed the obvious option to choose at the start over the blunderbuss due to its faster firing speed, but then I learned that the firing speed of both firearms is actually the same, and the blunderbuss even has the benefit of a greater shot spread, much like a shotgun, though the recovery speed is lower. Then again, if I ever found myself spam firing my gun in combat, it's because I was playing badly, just like spam rolling. You never actually have to make use of the stagger at all if you don't want to, and there are even offhand choices that don't even have the ability to stagger at all, like the Flame Sprayer or the Rosmarinus. But then, you're making the game substantially more difficult if you choose to ignore this mechanic, not to mention less fun. Staggering is especially useful for some of the hardest bosses, both in the base game and the DLC, to the extent that it can sometimes feel a bit cheap. The difficulty of bosses like Lady Maria, Gehrman and Orphan of Cause can be lowered significantly if you make effective use of staggers, though even with this weakness, they're still very challenging fights. Staggers come in particularly handy for the Father Gascoigne fight because he's just so aggressive and quick, but then again, more enemy aggression also means more opportunity for staggers. Even though we only hear a handful of dialogue from Gascoigne within this one boss fight, FromSoft still managed to make him a really compelling character, because you can interact with his whole family, both literally and morbidly. Before the fight, you can speak with his daughter, who will ask after her mother, Viola, and even give you a music box which his family would play to calm him down when he started to lose his mind, suggesting that Gascoigne butchered his own wife and threw her through this fence because she did not have the music box which would make him remember himself. If FromSoft had included this music box solely as some sort of key item to provide extra context for the boss, it'd still be an incredible touch, but the fact that you can also use it as a tool to help in battle is a beautiful fusion of boss design and storytelling, especially the way Beast Gascoigne holds his hands to his head in torment as he remembers that he's just killed his own wife. The tragedy doesn't even end there either, because if you bring Viola's brooch back to her daughter, she'll lament over the death of her mum and then run off to find her corpse, only to be eaten by the man-eater boar in the sewer, who yields her red ribbon upon death. And then you can have the exact same thing happen to her sister. It's an incredibly cruel and depressing questline with no real reward, and I love it. From my own experiences, the NPC questlines in Bloodborne have always been very easy to miss. In fact, I didn't even discover Gascoigne's daughter at all until several playthroughs in, and as for the Oedon Chapel questline in Cathedral Ward, without exaggeration, I think it was years until I realised that you can actually send all these people here. For anyone not familiar, the creepiest dude on earth here requests that you direct any sane Yharnamites over to this chapel where they will be safe from the beasts. Although his demeanour makes it seem like you definitely should not do this, and that he probably wants to sliver all over them like some creepy, slimy slug, you actually should do it because he turns out to be the nicest character in the whole game. There is an alternative place to send people though, that being Iosefka's clinic where we start out the game, but you should definitely not send anyone here unless you want to subject them to a cruel and unusual fate, though maybe you do want that. The voice acting of the imposter at the clinic here is masterfully done. There's just that subtle strangeness in her speech and the odd breathiness to her voice as if she's not quite all there mentally.
Let me ask you a small kindness. You're soon off to hunt, I presume? Then, if you find any survivors, tell them to seek Iosefka's clinic. Upon my Hippocratic oath, if they are yet human, I will look after them. Perhaps even cure them.
There are a bunch of great characters you can send over to the chapel, with brilliant dialogue and great personalities, which gradually deteriorate as major events transpire in the game's story. But I somehow missed all this shit before and only realised you can even populate the chapel to this extent after seeing some video on it on YouTube and thinking, oh fuck, I didn't know you can do that. That said, the method for getting the suspicious man to the chapel is both hilarious and ridiculous. He's something of a xenophobe, and so whichever supposed safe haven you tell him about, he'll go to the other one, and thus I chose Iosefka's clinic so that I can interact with him back at the chapel. I did this with the aid of a wiki, but I can't help but laugh at the idea of players who actually did want to send him to Iosefka's clinic, only to see his grumpy ass show up in the chapel anyway, because he's a dickhead here too. Hope nothing happens to him. The Cathedral Ward level after Father Gascoigne is a great deal bigger than Central Yharnam and a bit harder to navigate in my experience. There's a lot of areas in the game that I know the layout of by heart, having played through them so many times, with the exception of the Forbidden Woods, which I will never not get lost in. But there's something about Cathedral Ward that makes me unable to commit its layout to memory. There's just a ton of different paths and alleys to take, and every time I play through this level, at some point you're guaranteed to hear me say, how the fuck do you get to the Forbidden Woods again? Whereas Central Yharnam was primarily home to beasts, boars and trolls on the hunt for outsiders, the inhabitants of Cathedral Ward tend to be more strange than beastly, like these grotesque chapel giants and the creepy pale church servants, armed with cane, lantern and crucifix. This giant, in particular down here armed with the ball and chain, is the only one of its kind in the whole game as far as I know. Same with this one with the flaming fists in the upper floor of the lecture hall. And while we're shouting out unique enemies, how about this fuckboy with a massive heart? Although the main POI of interest is of course the Grand Cathedral at the top of the ward, this area has one of my favourite sections of the whole game. It's really just a small alley, with some residences to interact with, but this crooked, smoky corner of Yharnam is one of the places that always sticks in my mind when thinking of Bloodborne. And the conversations you can have with the on-edge, terrified Yharnamites from behind their doors as they nervously praise the church and the hunters, clearly indicating that criticism of the healing church was not something which was tolerated in Yharnam culture. The fact that a good chunk of dialogue in this game is with people you can't actually see really adds to the horror, because you can never be quite sure who or what you're talking to from behind that door. The only indication that a door can even be approached is the glowing red incense lantern outside, said to be effective at warding off beasts. Most of the folk you interact with in this manner are just plain hostile, though others are clearly batshit insane. As the game progresses though, you start getting nervous about initiating dialogue at these doors at all, because all of a sudden you start getting back very different responses than you did before. Thus, despite the various indoor Yharnamites who think they're safe from the beast scourge thanks to their incense, their beastly fates were always sealed due to the Yharnam blood in their veins. At the top of Cathedral Ward, past the chapel giants and church servants, stands the Grand Cathedral, within which awaits Vicar Amelia, hunched over chanting hushed prayers before transforming into the biggest beast we've seen yet. Very artistically done too, the way you only see the transformation via shadow. Sometimes it's more effective horror to leave the grislier details to the imagination, though if you want to partially ruin the horror for yourself and see what actually happens off screen here, check out Omega Fantasy's video on the matter. Like Gascoigne, Amelia can be very tough for people because she has a lot of health, a massive array of wild attacks, and unlike Gascoigne, she cannot be staggered with a well-timed gunshot. She is weak to fire though, and can be staggered by heavy strikes to her limbs. Although Bloodborne doesn't quite have the invisible stagger meter that Elden Ring does, larger enemies can still be staggered by targeting a limb or head, and this is key to making those massive health bars far more manageable for bosses like Amelia, Dark Beast Parrel, and especially the One Reborn. A cool ability that Amelia has, which she only sometimes pulls out, is that she can heal. I've always found the animation here to be rather sad and touching, the way she adopts this very human and feminine pose of prayer, not unlike Sylvan's beast on the bridge into Erythil in Dark Souls 3. Although Father Gascoigne is the first mandatory boss in the game, allowing access into the Cathedral Ward, he's not quite a major boss in the same way that Amelia is, and that beating him doesn't really progress the world. But beating Vicar Amelia does progress the game, advancing the world to nighttime, causing some enemies to fall asleep, and also making some items in the shop more expensive, the same way spirit emblems became more costly throughout Sekiro. As such, it's a good idea to stock up on as many blood vials and perhaps quicksilver bullets as possible as early as possible, ideally before even entering Cathedral Ward when blood vials are just $180, compared to later on in the game where they literally quadruple in price. The decision to move from automatically replenishing healing items to proper consumables which need to be purchased or farmed was a bit of an odd design choice. Of course, Demon's Souls had this same system, though it was a bit messier there with the 6 different varieties of grass, but then FromSoft found a much better alternative with Estus Flasks. Such a great system that almost every Souls-like went on to shamelessly copy it, along with the Bloodstain mechanic. That's why the Blood Vial move was a bit of a head scratcher. Like I said, if you're conscious about stocking up on blood vials early on, you can easily go through the whole game and never get close to running out. But then again, I'm saying that as someone who's finished the game countless times and who doesn't tend to die too much to bosses, although Ludwig sure ended up humbling the fuck out of me. If you're more of an inexperienced player, having to take time away from being able to organically progress through the game and repeatedly attempt bosses really can be a bummer. Although it's not quite the same thing, it reminds me of the horrendous boss runbacks from Dark Souls 2. If I die against a boss, I don't want to have to fanny around before my next attempt. I want to get right back in there and beat it, exactly like this. Making me run great distances back to the boss, or making me warp back to the Hunter's Dream and then warp over somewhere else to farm blood vials, before warping back to the Hunter's Dream again and then back to where the boss is, can get quite tedious, whereas they'd already figured all this out with Dark Souls. Perhaps the reason they did this relates to the sheer number of blood vials available to you right from the start, because 20 is a hell of a lot for the game to just replenish for free every time you die. But then again, you could theoretically get 20 Estus in Dark Souls 1 within the first hour of the game via the rite of kindling and a few humanity if you really wanted to. Another location accessible from Cathedral Ward is Old Yharnam, a very interesting location which is surprisingly completely optional, as are many of Bloodborne's other levels, like Hemwick Charnel Lane, the Lecture Hall, Upper Cathedral Ward, the Nightmare Frontier and Cainhurst. Old Yharnam was where the very first beast outbreak took place, before the Yharnam we start off in was even built. The beasts here are a somewhat different variety to the ones we see elsewhere too, being smaller, with many dealing poison build-up on attack. As a result of the outbreak, Old Yharnam was burnt to the ground by the powder keg hunters with their crude explosive weaponry, and the ruined city we see is the result. This event was even depicted in the first issue of the Bloodborne comics released a few years ago, of which I actually bought the first 4. Although there are a ton of beasts here, yet another excellent and thematically apt gameplay addition is that they fear fire and will shy away from it, hence the prior burning of the city by the hunters. There's also another NPC interaction here that I did not know was possible for several years, allowing you to make the hunter firing down upon you from the tower non-hostile, opening up extra dialogue. When you enter the area, Jura there warns you at first not to kill the beasts and to go no further into the city before firing. What I've always done here is simply get closer and then climb up the tower and fight him to claim his powder keg hunter's badge. However, if you defeat a later boss called Dark Beast Paro, accessible from Yahar'gul, and then make your way directly to Jura through a couple of shortcuts without killing any of his precious beasts along the way, he will suddenly be friendly to you. How the fuck you're supposed to know all this, I will never know. This is actually my first time even hearing this dialogue, and I only managed it via instructions from the wiki.
You to Old Yharnam. I've no interest in matters further up. But you must not disturb this place. The beasts do not venture above, and mean no harm to anyone. If you still insist on hunting them, then I will hunt you first.
By the way, same voice actor who played Marvelous Chester from Dark Souls 1, King Vendrick from Dark Souls 2, and King Osiros from Dark Souls 3. The Blood-Starved Beast at the end of Old Yharnam is one of my favourite bosses in the game, and I came so damn close to beating him without getting hit. But then I did get hit, and poisoned. The best word I can use to describe the Blood-Starved Beast's design is rancid. It doesn't even bleed blood upon being hit, with some ambiguous foul fluid flying from its wounds instead. Then further on in the fight it starts spraying potent toxin in all directions, inflicting you with poison just by standing near it. Just like with Vicar Amelia though, it is weak against fire, being a beast, and like many regular beast enemies, it can be totally distracted for 10 seconds through the use of a pungent blood cocktail item. This boss has one of the most fiendish grab attacks I've ever seen in a FromSoft game too, being nearly guaranteed to catch you out at first due to the fact that the startup animation is literally just it staying still for a second and a half before quickly lunging, and every time I've ever been caught out by this grab, it has killed me. It keeps you on edge too, because it can be hard to tell if the boss is winding up for an attack or just not doing anything. Beating the Blood-Starved Beast does reward you with your first Chalice, as well as unlocking this specific door in Oedon Chapel for some reason. I guess now's as good a time as any to talk about the Chalice Dungeons, perhaps one of Bloodborne's least enjoyed features, though many others like them a lot. Personally, my opinion on them is pretty mixed, though before this most recent playthrough, I was definitely further on the dislike side of the spectrum of Chalice Dungeon opinion. After getting the Thumeru Chalice dropped from the Blood-Starved Beast, you can place it in one of the headstones to the left side of the Hunter's Dreams, and after conducting the Chalice ritual, requiring just a wee bit of blood echoes and a couple of ritual bloods you'll likely have already picked up in Old Yharnam, you can enter into your first Chalice dungeon. Now, there was a certain deal of confusion about these back when the game first came out, because a lot of people thought these dungeons were randomised, but that's not the case. Only the dungeons accessed by root chalices have randomised layouts, while all other dungeons are fixed. A dungeon can have anywhere from 3 to 4 layers, and each layer will always have the same goal. Activate the lever to allow access into the boss room, then beat the boss. This is certainly easier said than done though, because the dungeons are crawling with monsters and traps, and they can be very tricky to navigate. The earlier ones with a depth of just 1 will tend not to be too complex, but even once you start getting onto depth 2, almost to the max difficulty of 5, shit can be absolutely labyrinthine, and this is exacerbated by the fact that many rooms and halls look the same, if not identical, between different layers and even different dungeons. That said, it is a really fun feeling when you find some new feature, enemy or room that you've never seen before in the dungeons, though after even a few hours of playing around in them, this will become increasingly rare. You can easily play through the game and never set foot in a Chalice dungeon, and while they absolutely serve as an excellent source of blood echoes, blood gems and blood shards, they're not at all necessary for making your character strong enough to take on the late game or even the DLC. In fact, the last I'd even played through all them was about 7 years ago, until I dabbled in them again here just so I can have a competent discussion on them for this retrospective. The reason I hadn't touched them in so long was because they'd previously left a rather bad taste in my mouth. Back then, I'd played through all the hardest dungeons before coming up against the end boss of the dungeon, that being Queen Yharnam, and by the end of that whole saga, I was sick of them. It's important to stress that a lot of the stuff you find in the more advanced Chalice dungeons is significantly more difficult than anything you encounter in the main game, to the point that after a certain point, the reason you continue grinding the dungeons is largely to get strong enough to handle even harder dungeons, and trust me, some of them will give you nightmares. Just ask anyone who's taken on the Watchdog of the Old Lords or Amygdala in the Defiled Chalice. I did, and I'll never do that again. That said, the best thing about the Chalice dungeons are the enemies and bosses, because rather than FromSoft just recycling enemies and bosses from the main game, there are tons of unique ones here that you won't find in the main game at all. Don't get me wrong, there are certainly a lot of recycled bosses too, but when they do appear they tend to be much harder, like this nightmare of a fight against Rom. The enemies and bosses unique to the dungeons really aren't lazy, tacked on things either, by the way. These are incredible high quality enemies with amazing designs and animations, like the Pthumerian Descendant, the Bloodletting Beast and the Undead Giant. There are even several variations of the Undead Giant, one of which happened to be perhaps the most difficult fight of this entire playthrough. Seriously, fuck this boss. I love its visual design, but fuck it. Although I was expecting to not have a great time with the Chalice dungeons once again here, I actually ended up having a lot of fun on them, and I especially enjoyed collecting the different ritual materials necessary for the more challenging dungeons. There are tons of different types of ritual materials too, and some of which are really rare, sometimes requiring a bit of hunting and farming, and this was an aspect of the game I did really enjoy. It's all quite addictive. That said, the fun does wear off, and while the intense and even unfair difficulty of some of the later dungeons can be somewhat off-putting, for me the greatest weakness of every Chalice dungeon is how damned repetitive they are. Like I said earlier, regardless of the difficulty of the dungeon you're in, your objective is always the same. Find the lever, then beat the boss, and this gets old fast, and this is made even worse due to the layered structure of each dungeon, because regardless of whether it has 3 layers or 4, they're all the same. Aspects between them will change, sure, but you're still essentially just finding a lever and beating a boss until you make it to the bottom layer. There's something about knowing exactly what to expect with the structure of each dungeon that gets really boring for me. I don't mean structure as in the actual layouts, but just the endless fucking levers, bonus rooms and bosses. The bosses themselves are probably the best part of this formula, but even with those you're going to be seeing a lot of repeats. In the several hours I spent doing a bunch of dungeons here, I saw the Watchdog of the Old Lords, the Keeper of the Old Lords and the Man-Eater Boar 3 times each, and the Pthumerian Descendant twice. And as cool as the unique dungeon enemies are, you also start to get a bit sick of seeing the same Snatchers, Pthumerian Guards and Merciless Watchers. Though it's a really nice surprise when you see something a bit unusual, like this odd slug, this roaming undead giant, and the Keeper of the Old Lords just patrolling the area with a couple of fire-breathing dogs. All in all, I have a better opinion of the Chalice dungeons now than I did before, but the repetitive nature can sadly cause the fun and novelty to wear off quicker than would be ideal. Although we learnt the password to gain access to the Forbidden Woods from the cutscene after the Vicar Amelia fight, there is an optional level to travel to first, which then leads onto a later optional level. Though the path to Hemwick Charnel Lane is guarded by a multitude of armed men, as well as the aforementioned Mad One enemies that come out to play if we have 15 insight or more, the actual area just ahead is populated nearly exclusively by women, with the odd troll and executioner. This area has some of the best ambience in the entire game, and when we're talking about a game like Bloodborne, that ain't nothing. God damn, I just want to take it all in and immerse myself in this thick, delicious atmosphere of smoke, bone dust and death, coupled with the auditory horror of the hysterical screams and maniacal laughs of the torch, sickle and cleaver wielding women. It's insane that this game came out back in 2015, just a year after Dark Souls 2, though that was also the year of The Witcher 3. A cool wee detail I discovered just in this playthrough was that these enemies have unique dialogue if you kill them with fire. I only discovered this by accident after one of them killed themselves by standing on a fire. However, our next main destination is the Forbidden Woods, which as far as I can tell is the largest level in the game. This place is a fucking twisted maze and very easy to get lost in. My favourite part of it is the start, where shit is still kind of recognisable and there's even a quaint, charming village with some old familiar beasts and Yharnamites. But in the second half the place totally goes off the rails, and in place of beasts you have axe-dragon vermin hosts and tangled snake balls, both large and small. I'll never figure out the fucking layout of this place, though usually if I can make it to this swamp, I'm golden. It's like the one landmark I can actually manage to memorise here. There is some very cool shit in the woods though. For one, the game's best NPC is to be found here, Volter, who wasn't actually added into the game until patch 1.09, 7 months after the game's release.
The night brims with defiled scum and is permeated by their rotten stench. Just think, now you're all set to hunt and kill to your heart's content. Hunt in cooperation with your fellows, your league confederates.
Now that's what I call voice acting. Volter has one of the sickest pieces of lore related to him too, because if you pick up the Constables set from the DLC, it tells a story about a group of foreign constables who were nearly all wiped out by a Yharnam beast, save one survivor who ate the beast whole. The item description doesn't mention Volter by name, but if you follow his questline by giving him 5 vermin, then he'll give you his eccentric helmet and can be summoned as Volter Beast Eater for a couple of DLC bosses. We also meet Patches in the Forbidden Woods, though he's very easy to miss, but he gives us a key item needed to gain access to yet another optional area, the Nightmare Frontier. Before we carry on to Byrgenwerth, there's one last noteworthy character found in the woods, and he's a shifty one, the suspicious beggar, who seems to be feasting on a few corpses before we interrupt his business. Now you can just attack him here and put an end to it, not that that's necessarily straightforward, but you can also send him off to the chapel, if you really think that's a good idea. As well as the fact that this is clearly a fucking psychopath, the chapel dweller does indicate to you earlier on that you've succeeded already in sending all the friendlier NPCs there, and that your work there is done. Also that he'd like to be your friend. Sorry, I'm busy. However, if you do send the beggar to the chapel, he will progressively start killing off its inhabitants as you make your way further through the game and kill more bosses. Before I'd even had a chance to fight another boss though, he'd already brutalised the sceptical man, and so before he had a chance to lay a hand on my precious fake grandmother, I took him out. Except he's actually a terrifying lightning beast that never appears anywhere else in the base game, with the exception of the Chalice Dungeons. This is such a cool surprise, because unless you've heard about this beforehand, you'll probably just assume you'll die in a couple hits, or it'll play out like a hunter fight. Not this. It also has some very interesting ramifications for the whole concept of beasthood, because even whilst transformed it still maintains intelligent speech, a far cry from the animalistic frenzy of nearly every other beast in the game. At the end of the Forbidden Woods, guarding the way to Byrgenwerth are the 3 Shadows of Yharnam. Back on my original playthrough, this was the first boss I struggled like hell on, to the extent that I just had to leave the area to level up my character and weapons elsewhere for a while before coming back. That said, the difficulty of this boss really is affected by how you choose to go about the fight, and whether you prioritise picking one shadow off at a time or try to spread out the damage. Due to the fact that there's one chucking groups of homing fireballs at you through the whole fight, it seems obvious that you should pick that one off first, and that's what I used to do, but conversely, it actually makes the fight harder, because the other 2 melee focused ones are much harder to deal with, and the second phase once they get access to their long-range snake attacks. If you fuck around for too long here without killing any of them, then this boss gets really hard to manage, hence why you want to have taken one of them out by the time phase 2 comes around. And if you've left the fireball one till last, well, good news. His AI is garbage and you can just do this. Though a snake summon can be surprisingly difficult to dodge if you're badly positioned. Apparently there was originally going to be a massive snake ball boss here, as documented by Lance McDonald, but despite technically being a gank boss, I think the shadows of Yharnam are great. You do encounter them again later on as regular enemies in the Nightmare of Mensis, except without all the snake tomfoolery. Just ahead of the shadows is the beautiful but bafflingly short Byrgenwerth, where it all started. Byrgenwerth scholars were the ones who originally discovered the old blood down in the tombs of the gods, which I think means the Chalice Dungeons. The head of Byrgenwerth, Master Willem, quickly grew to understand the dangers of the old blood though, instead emphasising the need for great insight before man could come closer to the eldritch truth and ascend higher as a species. But one of Willem's students at the school of Byrgenwerth, Laurence, was of a different mind, wanting to progress the human condition through the use of the old blood, causing him to split off from Byrgenwerth, just as we saw in the cutscene in the Grand Cathedral. From here, Laurence founded the Healing Church, of which he became its first vicar, hence his skull being venerated at the altar in the Grand Cathedral. Byrgenwerth itself seems to have been largely forgotten about though, in no small part thanks to being hidden far beyond the twisted paths of the Forbidden Woods, of which entry is only permitted to those who know the password. There's really not much exploring to be done in Byrgenwerth, and other than the short outdoor area outside the main building populated by these Garden of Eyes enemies, this is a remarkably small area, being more of an extension of the Forbidden Woods than its own proper level. The eye theme of the enemies here is extremely prevalent in Bloodborne, and it ties back to the idea of insight. If you read the description of the eye rune, it reveals that Master Willem himself sought to line his very brain with eyes to elevate his thoughts. Indeed, you actually see Willem himself sitting on the lunarium, clad in long robes as well as a blindfold, again going back to that thing of higher level vision in lieu of regular vision. We see other characters with various kinds of blindfolds on too, such as the Doctor in the opening cutscene, Father Gascoigne, the Suspicious Beggar, and every member of the choir, another group associated with the Healing Church, who don blindfold caps over their eyes in tribute to Master Willem. Speaking of choir members, one of the most obnoxious hunter enemies in the bloody game is to be found on the upper floor of Byrgenwerth, presumably there to protect the secrets of Byrgenwerth and stand guard for Master Willem, who cannot even speak at this point. Oh, have no fear, I'd never lay a hand on this feeble old man. As well as being generally swift, tricky and tanky, this is the first time where the player will see one of the most obnoxious fucking attacks in the game, a Call Beyond. It's just so hard to dodge and does way too much damage, to the point where if it hits you, you have a very high chance of just dying. Furthermore, there's not an effective enough counter to enemies who use this. If you're extremely fast, you can shoot a gun at them to cancel the attack, but if you're even slightly too slow, the attack will still just go off anyway and you'll probably die. I guess the one upside to this is that you can actually get a hold of this attack yourself, except it has an arcane requirement of 40, which you probably won't have unless you specifically went for an arcane build. Hunter enemies in general tend to be very challenging in this game because they have all the same tricks and attacks as you, except unlike you, they often have significantly more health and do much more damage. Seriously, even regular hunter encounters out in the world can be a decent bit more difficult than some bosses, and these encounters can be very frustrating. One-on-one fights are bad enough, like the one in Byrgenwerth, or even the fight against Hemwick where we have the help of Eileen, but later on in Yahar'gul the game throws 3 against you at once, one of whom has a fucking cannon and another with a tiny tonitress, either of which can easily one-shot you. The one consolation with hunter enemies is that they don't respawn after death, but even so, for as much as I can appreciate the difficulty of this game, it can get a bit excessive and frustrating with the hunter fights. The number one most difficult such fight though is of course the Bloody Crow of Cainhurst, who you face at the Grand Cathedral at the end of Eileen's questline. Holy shit, this fight sucks. It has so much health, does insane damage even with its repeating pistol firearm, and just when you think you're doing well, it pops a blood vial. I took on this hunter pretty early on and struggled, but although it took me over 4 minutes straight, it looked like I was actually going to win. but then it killed me with a random pistol shot right at the fucking end. Absolutely devastating. That said, I did turn back here much later and had a surprisingly easy time by simply poking it for high damage with my Holy Moonlight Sword, courtesy of Ludwig. Out on the Lunarium, the path forward is profoundly unconventional, but as indicated by Willem's feeble gestures, we have to step off the balcony and down into the Moonside Lake below the water, while the baffling form of Rom, the vacuous spider, becomes visible off in the distance. Very unusual boss design, both visually and mechanically, especially with how it won't even attack you until the second cycle where it teleports away. You can easily end up being overrun by spiders here, especially if you can't be arsed clearing the old ones out after each cycle, though this is way more of an issue if you see Rom out in the Chalice Dungeons, which I did. Cool trick that speedrunners use for Rom is to hit it with a charged attack right at the point where it's going to teleport away, making it stick around for a while longer. And if you're really strong and make use of a beast blood pellet and bolt paper, it's possible to take the boss out before it can teleport away at all. Just as Vicar Amelia caused the game world to shift forward in time, altering the skybox and causing other smaller changes, killing Rom precipitates an even more dramatic transformation, turning the moon red and bringing it terrifyingly close to Yharnam, to the point where it seems to hang below the sky rather than existing as some distant celestial body. Furthermore, from this point on, the sky itself completely changes to a visceral cosmic purple, colouring the rolling clouds beneath. After the boss, the game warps us to Yahar'gul, Unseen Village, an area which can be accessed via the Cathedral ward, but which was up until now inaccessible unless you allowed yourself to get manhandled by a snatcher earlier on. As well as this transportation into this nightmarish location, Rom's death is also the catalyst for other events occurring throughout the world. For one, if you travel back to Oedon Chapel, everyone is not alright at all, with what remains of people's minds having now completely snapped with the coming of the Red Moon, and the same is largely true of Iosefka's impostor. Although as with many things in this game it's easy to miss, there's a cave just by the village in the Forbidden Woods which actually leads all the way down back to Yharnam after passing through a quicksilver swamp populated by discarded giants and giant leeches. And from the other end we enter Iosefka's clinic for real, whereas before you couldn't access the upper level. As easily missable and optional though it may be, it's for sure a good idea to come here after beating Rom, because 1, you can pick up the Cainhurst summons allowing access to a whole new level, and 2, Iosefka's impostor is here being in a state of distress. Although you can come here before killing Rom, I never do this because the impostor will be hostile here and you'll miss out on one of the game's third umbilical cords. But if you come after, she seems to be pregnant in some way and in great agony, twitching and giggling as if she's lost her mind. And as if it needed saying again by me, amazing voice acting.
Nauseous. Have you felt this? It's progressing. I can see things. I knew it. I'm different. I'm no beast. Oh God, it feels awful. But it proves that I'm chosen. Don't you see how they writhe inside my head? It's rather rapturous.
Killing her here does get you the third umbilical cord though, or the 1/3 of umbilical cord as it's apparently called in the US, even though there are actually 4 of them available, though you only need 3 to gain the right to fight the true final boss. At this point, before discussing any further areas, I think it's about bloody time I talked about one of Bloodborne's coolest features, trick weapons. I realise this topic's placement so late in the video is a bit odd, but I like to space out my discussions on game mechanics in between discussions of levels and bosses, which is another way of saying I'm not very good at essay structure. Although Bloodborne doesn't have anywhere near close to the number of weapons found in the Souls games or Elden Ring, the weapons it does have are significantly more interesting because they can transform. In Dark Souls you've got your one-handed light attack and heavy attack, then your two-handed light attack and heavy attack, as well as your running and jump attacks and maybe even a weapon art or Ash of War in the case of Dark Souls 3 or Elden Ring. The main reason for switching to two-handing is for a bit of extra damage output at the expense of a shield, or maybe because you prefer the two-handed moveset more than the one-handed moveset. No one weapon really provides a particularly high level of complexity, but the strength of the combat mechanics as well as the sheer number of weapons mean that the complexity simply isn't needed. In Bloodborne, the complexity of movesets still isn't really that high, but it certainly is higher, because each weapon has two different forms. The extent to which the second form of a given weapon differs from the first really does vary from weapon to weapon, but in most cases the difference in moveset between the two forms is substantial, and thus, instead of just switching to two-hand for a bit more damage like you do in Dark Souls, you're effectively switching to a new weapon. For example, the Kirk hammer transforms from a swift blade for slashing to an enormous hammer. The threaded cane transforms from a, cane to a segmented whip, and the hunter's axe transforms from a small axe into a bigger axe. The most interesting weapons definitely are the ones with the more dramatic transformations, whereas to me the least interesting ones, and the ones I almost never use, are those with the second form as just a firearm, like the rifle spear or the Reiter Plash. The reason for this is simply that I already have a firearm in my offhand, and so rather than a weapon that just transforms into another gun, I prefer the Beast Cutter, please, or better yet, the Whirligig Saw. The game also cheats a wee bit with some trick weapons by making their second form do some sort of elemental damage as opposed to changing into a whole new thing, like the Tonitress or the Boomhammer. Before all you Boomhammer fanatics go reaching for that dislike button, please stop, because I'm something of a boomer myself. It's just that I prefer the weapons with proper transformations. One of the coolest aspects of trick weapons is how fluid it feels to transform back and forth between their forms in the midst of battle, because instead of punishing the player for trying to switch to one or the other in a fight with some long animation where you're vulnerable for a second or two, there are designated transform attacks which can be thrown into the middle of a combo, and you can even do back-to-back transform attacks if you've got the stamina for it. Furthermore, these tend to be really strong and are key to building up beast meter if you've popped a beast blood pellet. You don't even need to throw them into the middle of a combo either, because transform attacks can even be performed just after a dash. And I remember making use of this extensively back when fighting Gehrman on my Blood level 4 run of the game last year, because of the extra damage from transform attacks. As great as the trick weapons are, there really weren't a huge number of them in the base game. In fact, there were just 14, and not all of them were that great or interesting, like the Rifle Spear or Stake Driver. However, the DLC added an additional 12 weapons, and this was both much needed and very welcome, because these are some of the sickest weapons in the game, by far. They're far more crude and brutal too, as the Old Hunter DLC of course features older versions of weapons. Thus, instead of the somewhat elegant threaded cane, you have the far more brutal Beast Cutter, which completely forgoes any illusions of subtlety or dignity. Then you have the Whirligig Saw, literally designed to rip beasts to shreds with its spinning serrated teeth. As far as upgrading goes, it's all done in the Hunter's Dream, and it's the same standard FromSoft fare when it comes to upgrade materials, with Bloodstone being the material of choice in this game. Back in the day though, unless you were willing to delve very far into the Chalice Dungeons, it was only possible to get one Bloodrock per playthrough, which was pretty shitty to be honest. But when the DLC arrived, they made it possible to get another one there, as well as giving you the option to buy a Bloodrock with 60 insight. Now that's a lot of insight, but if you've been hoarding your Madman's knowledge and Great One's insight since the start of the game, it's not that difficult to afford. Though apparently you can farm for insight in the Chalice Dungeons too. Where things get a bit more interesting though, is with Blood Gems. These can be slotted into your weapons to gain various damage bonuses, and while the early gems you find might only increase your damage output by a few percent, the later ones can give you a massive boost to damage. You'll find great Blood Gems in later levels of the game, particularly in the Nightmare of Mensis, but by far the best gems are to be found in the Chalice Dungeons, though again, you need to delve very deep into them if you're after the really good ones. And be prepared to fight some brutally difficult bosses there too. If you're a fan of min-maxing though, or you're one of those folk who enjoy spending hours and hours trying to craft the optimal build in games like Neo 2, then the hunt for ever more powerful Blood Gems can be great fun, but again, you really don't need all that power for the base game, or the DLC for that matter. Although if you plan on taking on the hardest bosses of the Chalice Dungeons, then I guess every extra little bit of damage output does help. The main criticism I have with Blood Gems is that the only ones that actually seem worth bothering with are those which provide flat percentage increases to raw damage output, whereas I just never saw the utility of the ones that added poison build-up or elemental damage to your weapon, or the ones that specifically buff thrust or blunt damage. I would have liked to try these out, but the difference in damage output always seemed worse than going for pure physical, so why would I ever bother with it? But now let's get back to our journey, please. After beating Rom, we're warped to Yahar'gul, and this is where the game shows its true face. Sure, we've seen plenty of weird shit up until now, and plenty of formidable bosses, both wild and weird, but Yahar'gul is where it goes off the fucking rails. For a start, there are enormous amygdalas hanging from buildings for who knows what purpose, and they don't just politely mind their own business either. They will try and fuck you up with portals and lasers. It's terrifying once you see these things up close, so you can even fight one of them in the Nightmare Frontier area where it rips its own arms off to attack you with. Sick. Speaking of amygdalas, although you can get an early look at the one back in Cathedral Ward if you have 40 insight, it'll become fully visible regardless of your insight after the Blood Moon phase is initiated, another indication that Yharnam is currently going through an extremely significant and terrifying transition as the line separating reality from nightmare becomes increasingly blurred. It's the Cathedral Ward amygdala that's responsible for transporting you to the Hunter's Nightmare of the DLC, whereas the one located just above the doorway leading to Yahar'gul will whisk you away to the Lecture Theatre, followed by the Nightmare Frontier. The Nightmare Realms and the concept of nightmares are very interesting in Bloodborne, being layered on top of each other. So, the Hunter's Nightmare is located at the very bottom, which makes sense with it being the first nightmare containing the old hunters. Then above that, you have the fishing hamlet, hence the shell lady who falls down from above, the same kind we later encounter in the hamlet. And then at the very top, you have the Nightmare Frontier. We know it's at the top because 1, it's called the Nightmare Frontier, and 2, you can see ship masts down below, and there are numerous ship masts visible from the hamlet. All very cool, but the term nightmare itself is initially slightly misleading, because rather than us falling asleep and visiting the game's various nightmare environments there, it's more accurate to think of them as nightmares conjured up by some vessel or group of people which then become alternate planes of reality to be visited and explored by us. I'm hesitant to offer too much in the way of explanation about the deeper aspects of this game's lore though, because I'm far more a student than a scholar when it comes to Bloodborne. And while I think this game's lore is absolutely fascinating, I also think it's the most confusing of all Soulsborne games. I just find it really difficult to follow and maintain an understanding of it in my mind for any proper period of time before it starts to slip away, much like a dream or nightmare. Although Yahar'gul itself is not a nightmare realm, it's sure as hell a fucking nightmare, and an incredible level to behold, not least of all because of the blood moon and purple sky. You can visit this location much earlier on after beating Vicar Amelia, but it's nighttime then, and also I ended up screwing myself over because after getting transported there I dropped down and fought Dark Beast Parel, which is all great and all, but if you do this without touching the Hunter's Lamp back in the Hypogean jail, you cannot come back here until after you beat Rom. This place is absolutely crawling with cramped caskets, which is one of the sickest names for an enemy ever by the way. These things can kill you way too easy though. I mean, look at this shit. Really? After fighting swarms of these things and dodging their absurdly long-range blood projectiles, we come to one of the coolest boss intro cutscenes and one of the most disgusting boss designs of all time. The One Reborn. Jeez, this thing is absolutely rancid. By the way, I somehow lost my footage of fighting this boss, and so I'm using footage from Boss Fight Database here. Just want to disclaim that this is not me playing. Although the One Reborn itself functions very differently to it, this boss is something of an homage to the Tower Knight from Demon's Souls, with the 6 Bell Maidens doing ranged attacks from above. Only this boss is a lot more juicy, and with more limbs. In my experience, the One Reborn can either be pathetically easy, or a complete fucking nightmare. If you go into it with a beast blood pellet and a fire or bolt paper and manage to stagger it with a few heavy attacks, you can do massive damage really quickly, especially if you're making use of transform attacks to build beast meter and throwing in a nice big critical to cap it all off. Now if you don't quite have the damage or confidence to go that route, then this boss can be absolutely miserable. Back when I did my Blood Level 4 run of the game, there were really only 2 bosses which gave me trouble from the base game, and those were the One Reborn and Gehrman. Holy shit, this thing sucks if your health and damage is not up to scratch, because the damage it does is no joke, and it can be very difficult to even get close enough to attack without being in real danger of being kicked from one of its gross legs or some other ambiguous appendage. Upon this disgusting boss's death, we can progress to the end of Yahar'gul and into a chamber filled with the long dead members of the School of Mensis, yet another branch of the Healing Church. Yet while the choir is concerned with commune with the cosmos, the School of Mensis occupied itself with far darker rituals involving kidnapping, contact with the amygdalas, and the creation of the Nightmare of Mensis, which we enter by laying our hand on the mummified corpse of the host of the nightmare, Micolash, at least after first traversing through the lecture theatre and confronting Patches for fucking us over with his tonsil stone nonsense. I always choose the obvious option here and select "Of course I think ill of you," but this time I went with the second option and I realised I'd never heard this dialogue before, and once again this voice acting is just about enough to make me come, close to jumping for joy, because I cannot even believe how good this voice acting is.
Indeed, I should think not. I shared with you a thing most secret. Now you're witness to a miracle, and all the stronger for it. You should appreciate it, if you've a grain of gratitude in you. Yes. Appreciate it.
I love how everyone in the game sounds unhinged, even the folk who are friendly to us. Everyone's afflicted with that peculiar Yharnam madness, and after you kill Rom, people really go screwy. The Nightmare of Mensis is the single most challenging area in the base game, and is pretty much the last main area before the final boss if you exclude the optional levels. Being a nightmare, it is pretty fucking nightmarish, containing a bunch of weird new monsters and beasts. The Laurence silver beasts in particular are absolutely wild, and enemies like this make me wish so badly that Bloodborne had some sort of model viewer so we can get a closer look at these insane detailed designs. An interesting aspect of this enemy is that even though they carry torches, a pretty strange thing for a beast to do, if you land the finishing blow with a fire based attack, they'll die completely and that'll be that. Whereas kill them in any other way and they'll let out several maggot leech things, which I think are one of the harder enemies in the game somehow. Seriously, why are these things such a pain in the arse? I'd rather go up against 10 of these things than 10 of these any day. An initially baffling aspect to the outdoor section of this level is that constant frenzy build-up and damage when out from cover as that distant elevated chamber glows a bright maddening red, though it can also affect enemies here too, as you can see. Frenzy is a very troublesome status effect, and while it's certainly not as bullshit and punishing as Sekiro's terror, it's a decent bit worse than Elden Ring's madness. What makes it so challenging is that the enemies who use it most, the winter lanterns, can cause frenzy build-up just by looking at you, as well as some damage, and also, even after you kill one, the meter just keeps on building up anyway for a few seconds further, and so when up against them you need to focus on more things at once compared to in regular combat. You have to be looking at your frenzy meter to determine how long you've got until 75% of your max health disappears. You need to know when to pop a sedative to cancel out the meter, or decide if you should just tank it with blood vials instead. And you need to do all this while also paying attention to the monster itself, who will assault you with high damage grab attacks, which themselves cause even more frenzy if you get hit. One really great trick though, if you can manage it, is to initiate a critical attack just when your frenzy is about to pop, because you actually have complete invincibility during this animation and will take no damage. As much as frenzy sucks, the main reason for its reputation really is the winter lanterns in particular. There are other enemies who make use of it, like the Garden of Eyes and the crucifix-wielding church servants, but none inspire as much terror as these nightmare-dwelling creatures, constantly singing that unsettling song. Regarding that mysterious source of frenzy at the beginning of this nightmare, its origin is actually a terrible and rotten Great One, discovered by the School of Mensis. And we can even interact with it and kill it later on in the level, though the path to it is pretty damn easy to miss and fraught with frenzy. If you do manage to reach this level to drop the brain of Mensis from its chamber, then you can freely roam around the outside area without having to seek cover, though I've never quite understood how we can then just walk up to it here without it having any effect on us. Also, fuck knows how anyone figured this out. but if you perform the make contact gesture and hold it for about 50 seconds, you will be rewarded with the level 3 moon rune, and killing this thing is also the only way to get the living string ritual material for the Chalice Dungeons, though you can also buy more with insight once you get this done. The boss of this level, or at least the first one, is a bit of a controversial one, because FromSoft managed to make him both excellent and shit at the same time, somehow. The boss arena is very unusual for a Soulsborne game, and you can even call it unique. Yes, you've got examples of massive boss arenas in Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring, but those are very open, whereas Micolash's arena is a damned labyrinth which opens up even further in the second phase. Back when I first played this game, I got super frustrated here because I didn't understand the gimmick requiring you to lure him into specific rooms, and so I remember just chasing Micolash around for about 10 minutes like a fool, getting progressively more irate, and not being able to figure out what the fuck I was supposed to do. Yeah, I'm not very bright. It's not really so bad though once you figure out the layout a bit more and learn which points to drop down from. Until recently I thought it was totally impossible to kill him in phase 1 before he disappears, but turns out nope, you can actually take him out fully here. Speedrunners never fail to impress me. Although this boss has an incredible atmosphere, soundtrack and interesting arena, it's Micolash himself who is a letdown, because he's shit. It plays out like a regular hunter fight, except he doesn't even have a weapon, instead relying on the occasional punch in between spamming the Augur of Ebrietas attack, and so he's actually extremely easy. Well, at least up until he effortlessly one-shots you with a Call Beyond in phase 2. Great, let's take a piss-weak boss, not even bother to give him a unique moveset, but then give him one of the most obnoxious attacks in the game. Bit of a perplexing design decision there, because if there's one thing Bloodborne is not lacking, it's interesting enemies and bosses, and so I would have liked Micolash himself to be a more interesting enemy. Beyond Micolash, climbing higher and higher up the nightmare, we see the tall, pale form of Yharnam, the Pthumerian queen, the same lady we saw after defeating Rom, triggering the Blood Moon. Yharnam is of course the figure who the city itself was named after, though bear in mind that she was not the Queen of Yharnam, Yharnam was just her name. She is the mother of the infant Great One, Mergo, a child who we never actually see, but whose crying we faintly hear all around Yharnam after the Blood Moon begins to hang low, and also upon approaching the seemingly empty cradle in the arena beyond the elevator, triggering the appearance of Mergo's wet nurse. Just as Mergo seems to lack form, a very cool detail of the wet nurse is that there's also nothing under its robes, it's just a load of clothing and blades. This is a boss I've always thought was super easy, largely because it tends to spam this attack where it floats around while slashing with its many blades at either side, allowing you to just squeeze up behind it and attack while only taking the occasional hit. The boss also has another phase where the arena goes black and it duplicates and attacks you from the darkness, but I managed to beat it before this could even happen. After beating the boss though, we get a very interesting message pop up, because instead of the usual prey slaughtered, we get nightmare slain. And indeed you never hear Mergo's cries again after this, presumably indicating that we've put an end to Mergo, at least in some way. If you travel back out the arena after beating the boss, Yharnam even bows to you before disappearing, and so this was clearly something she wanted to happen, though it's all rather vague. One very important item we do get for beating the boss though is a third umbilical cord. Of course we got one after killing the Iosefka imposter, and there's also another one within the abandoned workshop in the Cathedral ward where we can also find a pretty doll's outfit that I definitely did not try on. The umbilical cords are very important to consume though, because although each one will grant you 3 additional insight, they're also the key to unlocking the true final boss and secret ending. At this point you can literally end the game if you like. The Hunter's Dream is aflame, and thanks to our actions in the Nightmare, the Mensis ritual has been stopped, meaning that our work as a hunter is complete. Bloodborne does a very interesting thing and lets you skip not only the true final boss but also the first final boss, and if you respond to Gehrman, who awaits at the foot of the tree with "Submit your life," he will chop off your head with his burial blade and you will wake under the morning sun, ending the game. Dialogue from Jura and Eileen also strongly implies that they've been through the same sort of process, as they will reference the Hunter's Dream themselves, though what they may have fought through and which great ones they may have slain, not to mention how long ago, who knows. However, we're not going to do that pussy shit, because of course we want to fight Gehrman, otherwise how will I hear his sweet, sweet boss soundtrack? Ah, but not yet though, because there is also a couple of optional areas to cover as well as the tremendous DLC. The Old Hunters. Let's talk about Upper Cathedral Ward first, and then Cainhurst. Whereas we've been to the Cathedral Ward where the Healing Church is based, then Byrgenwerth where it all began, and even Yahar'gul, which was Mensis territory, situated right at the top of Cathedral Ward is where the choir is based, the branch of the church most concerned with the stars and cosmos. Whereas Mensis sought contact with Great Ones through ritual and nightmare, the choir have devised other ways of contact and communication with these eldritch beings, one of which they have in their goddamn basement. Who left this here? I love how you can see the areas of Cathedral Ward that you have previously visited down below, like here where we fought the chapel giants. A very creative and rather unnerving touch are the celestial larvae creatures moving and facing towards the Grand Cathedral. And I like these things because, although you can kill them if you really want, they're more of a moving, living decoration than a proper threatening enemy to worry about. All the other enemies here are ones you've already seen elsewhere, though Upper Cathedral Ward definitely has the highest concentration of brain suckers in the whole game, and spying them roaming around in the darkness coupled with the eerie music makes this a genuinely unnerving level to play through. There's a really cool trick you can do here too, where you hit this brain sucker through the wall with the whip form of the threaded cane until it dies, getting you the orphanage key and allowing you to bypass some of the level. I tried it using the whip version of the beast cutter instead and kind of fucked it up. Oh well. The presence of an orphanage in this messed up place conjures up some very disturbing implications about what happened to all the children, though the number of celestial larvae here likely tells us all we need to know about that, while either them or the celestial emissaries just ahead. These alien looking things are also to be found in the Forbidden Woods and Iosefka's clinic, but you fight a whole gang of them here. Fun wee boss, but not really much to say about it. You can beat in about 20 seconds. Now that I think about it, I don't think there's a single bad boss in the base game. The quality of bosses in the Chalice Dungeons certainly do vary, but as far as the mandatory and optional bosses go, they're all pretty great. The Witches of Hemwick is a bit weak, but they're certainly not bad, and while Micolash was let down by his uninspired moveset, everything else about that boss fight is superb. The DLC bosses in particular though are incredible, and very, very difficult. Ludwig. Though you can be forgiven for thinking the Celestial Emissary marks the end of the Upper Cathedral Ward level, there is actually more to this area, accessible by smashing the window here, putting us right above the Grand Cathedral where we earlier fought Vicar Amelia. You can see the altar where we touched Laurence's skull and everything. Just as the School of Mensis had its dark secrets, so too does the choir, having a great one named Ebrietas living beneath the cathedral, and the presence of the celestial emissaries in the area just before implies they've been using these strange creatures to communicate with Ebrietas. My experience of this boss has always been a bit messy. I love its gross design and how there's nothing in any way familiar about its appearance, with its ambiguous organs, tentacles and tubes, but mechanically it's just never felt all that tight to me in the way that bosses like the Wet Nurse and Vicar Amelia do. To be honest, it might just be my own approach that sucks, because I usually do try and just run in and frantically hit its head to make it stagger and allow for way more follow-up damage, especially with a Beast Blood pellet. Its second phase is super cool though I'd somehow never noticed before that it generates a subtle spherical aura around itself that you take gradual damage from over time whilst inside. Ebrietas has one attack which people absolutely hate though, her charge attack, and it's so detested because as well as doing massive damage, it's extremely difficult to dodge, probably excessively difficult to dodge to be honest, though I have seen worse. There's a very strange altar at the back of the arena showing something that looks an awful lot like Rom, except with proper spider legs, instead of the malformed things the actual Rom scuttles around on. There's really nothing to do at this place yet, though it does come into play later on in relation to a certain Cainhurst queen. Cainhurst is the most unique area in all of Bloodborne, and whereas Yharnam and its surrounding areas are largely Lovecraft inspired, especially Yahar'gul and the Nightmare levels, Cainhurst is far more inspired by Bram Stoker's Dracula. Even our method of getting to the castle is eerily similar to that book's main character's journey by carriage to Dracula's mountain castle in Transylvania. Cainhurst looks fucking beautiful, if you'll pardon my Romanian, and it has such interesting character, both outside and in, with one of its main recurring features being the eerie statues dotted all over the place. I like this one in particular. They'd go on to repeat this motif in Elden Ring 2 of course in the Shaded Castle. I hope no one's too fatigued by my many references and comparisons to other FromSoft games, by the way. I just find it interesting to see how different ideas and mechanics get expanded on from game to game. There are so many great, creepy touches in this place, like how even though you ride a horse-drawn carriage to the castle, when the cutscene ends and you turn around, the horses look to have been dead for months, if not years, and even the bridge leading here is completely destroyed. Then, the portcullis leading into the courtyard opens up on its own, coupled with the huge door leading inside the castle itself slowly creaking ajar, and let's not forget the constant gaze of the statues in the castle's halls and chambers. My favourite moment by far here is when you first enter the foyer and are greeted by all this absolute splendour, coupled with his servant literally in the process of waxing the floors to keep them shiny. I half expect Sir Alon to jump out at me here. All that said, for as cool as Cainhurst is, it's not my favourite area, and that's because I feel that it's missing some other cool enemy type. Yes, you do have the parade of crying women who will attack you with knives, some without their fucking heads on, but these enemies do more to add to the dark, elegant ambience of the level rather than being mechanically enjoyable to fight. There are the gargoyles, but these things are kinda lame and way too easy to beat, although the little rapier wielding dudes are pretty cool. Not that there's many of them. I think Cainhurst could have used an extra, bigger, meatier enemy, something like the Tomb Guardians from the Chalice Dungeons, or even a variant of the Executioners. That said, I am being pretty damn nitpicky because they could have just recycled enemies from other areas, but they didn't. Also, side note here, but doesn't Cainhurst remind you a lot of the castle from Resident Evil Village, which came out 6 years later? Maybe not the interior quite so much, but certainly the general look of the castle and the rooftops. I don't think Capcom actually copied Bloodborne, by the way, just a pointless observation. Martyr Logarius is the boss of the area, though the runback is a bit shitty due to there only being a single hunter's lamp in the whole of Cainhurst, though there is an elevator and a shortcut back here at least. Pretty damn tough freaking boss, and he can be very fast and aggressive, but due to him being relatively human shaped and not an enormous ferocious beast, it is very possible to stagger him with a gunshot, and if you get halfway decent at the timing, you really can trivialise the boss. His downward slam after flying up into the air is particularly ripe for a stagger, though I kept screwing it up and missing my chance. By the way, doesn't the sword he plunges into the ground in his second phase kinda resemble Soulbrand from Demon Souls or the Drake's sword from Dark Souls 1? Although you can beat Logarius, then piss off home to Yharnam again, he drops the same crown he was wearing on the ground at the other end of the arena, and equipping it triggers a cutscene shattering an illusion, obscuring the audience chamber to Annalise, Queen of the Vile Bloods. After this cutscene is done though, always best to sell the crown. It sadly does not have any other special properties, and you get $35,000 for it. Although the interaction with Annalise is largely in aid of a PvP covenant, something which I have no interest in, it does also lead to one of my favourite scenes in the game. We've encountered a character named Alfred a couple of times before this within the Cathedral ward, and he's as sweet as pie to us. A friendly chap, eager to exchange information and gift us with the finest gifts. Alfred is, however, a member of a group known as the Executioners, the sworn enemy of the Vile Bloods, the last of which is Queen Annalise here, and Martyr Logarius, who we fought earlier, was actually the leader of the Executioners, at least until he took it upon himself to guard the way to Annalise before we went and fucked that up. And so, if you give Alfred a summons to Cainhurst, he gets the ability to travel there the same way we do, triggering this scene.
I've done it! I've done it! I smashed and pounded and grounded this rotten siren into fleshy pink pulp. There, you filthy monstrosity! What good's your immortality now? Try stirring up trouble in this sorry state. All mangled and twisted, with every inside on the outside for all the world to see.
Jeez, what the fuck, dude? This is mental. What are you doing, Alfred? The game's full of really dark and brutal stuff, including, as we saw, children being eaten by pigs, but this is so hardcore, he turns into a psychopath out of nowhere. For finishing Alfred's quest, he gives you the Wheel Hunter badge, unlocking for purchase his Wheel of Logarius weapon and the gold Ardeo hat. Despite Alfred completely fucking up Annalise beyond all recognition, though she is in fact immortal, much like a vampire, and so if you collect her flesh here and take it to the altar of despair in the same arena where we killed Ebrietas, you can bring her back to life. I guess they did this because you need Annalise to be alive to continue to progress with the Vile Blood Covenant PvP stuff. Though I think it's a real shame how even if you do bring her back to life, Annalise doesn't reference having been mangled by Alfred at all. Her dialogue doesn't change in the slightest, even though we just resurrected her. Kinda lame. And now we can dig into the DLC, the Old Hunters, accessible any time after defeating Vicar Amelia by picking up the eye of a blood-drunk hunter from the Hunter's Dream and letting yourself be picked up and crushed by the amygdala outside Cathedral Ward. I really like that they made it accessible so early, because although you're likely to get destroyed if you try and take it on straight after beating Amelia, it does provide you the opportunity to run straight through the Hunter's Dream to grab a few weapons before continuing on with the main game. That's a slight issue with a few of the coolest base game weapons. You'll likely only unlock them very late into your playthrough, like the Chikage, Logarius Wheel and Blades of Mercy. Although I guess you could just kill Alfred and Eileen earlier on instead of doing their questlines, though this is easier said than done if you try and take them on at a low level with unupgraded gear. Remember what I said about some of the hunter fights being incredibly difficult? Well, that applies to the NPCs too if you decide to attack them. In the DLC though, you can grab the Beast Cutter, Beast Hunter Safe, Amygdalian Arm and Whirligig-Saw just a few minutes from the spawn point. The concept for the DLC is that it's another nightmare, one which hunters go to after becoming blood drunk. Just as we see the effects of the Beast Scourge on the general Yharnam populace, as well as the clergy, hunters will eventually lose their minds and turn blood drunk after slaughtering enough beasts. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why the later iterations of hunter weapons aren't quite as crude and brutal as the early ones. Though let's be honest, the Saw Cleaver is still pretty damn brutal. As the item description for the Eye of the Blood Drunk Hunter says, a hunter who goes drunk with blood is said to be taken by the nightmare, destined to wander forever, engaged in an endless hunt. It is a fate that no hunter can escape. Well, this is that nightmare, a warped, incomplete and chaotic version of the Cathedral Ward fused with central Yharnam, except populated by the early hunters wearing their old-fashioned garb and armed with beast cutters and beast hunter safes. These enemies are way fucking better than the boring old hunters we see in the base game, being significantly larger, more intimidating and more enjoyable to fight, playing more like well-designed enemies who resemble hunters rather than NPCs with the same moves and abilities as us. I'll take these fellas over the Cainhurst Crow any day of the week. There are also beasts to be found here, but instead of the larger ones we see throughout central Yharnam, they're the small variety of old Yharnam, which makes sense because these were how the beasts looked during the first outbreaks. In their frenzied state though, the old hunters here do a good enough job on their own of taking care of the beasts, not to mention the big boulder on top, followed by the emergence of the second most terrifying enemy in the DLC. I won't reveal who the first most terrifying enemy is yet, but it sounds like this. Everyone who's played this DLC will be painfully aware of that sound, I'm sure. Heading into this nightmare version of the Grand Cathedral reveals the burning form of Laurence laying upon the altar, and although he's not the first boss of the DLC that you fight, he is the first one that you see, yet to everyone's initial surprise I'm sure he's completely non-hostile here, only coming into action if you come back later on with his skull found just before the research hall. All rather confusing, because we saw Laurence's skull back in the real version of Cathedral Ward, and it looks like the skull of a beast, and indeed you see Laurence here as a beast, but then you pick up his skull later on in the nightmare and it's a human skull. Throw me a fucking bone here, FromSoft, please. There are lore hunters who actually think that the bloodletting beast found in the Chalice Dungeons is Laurence, the headless version in particular, though I've never been too convinced of this. It's a cool idea, but a bit too far-fetched for my liking, even for FromSoft. I've heard a lot of people talk about Laurence being a shit boss, and that they hate him, not least of all because he's kind of a reskin of the Cleric beast, but me myself personally, I've always loved this boss. But then I'm also a big fan of the Blue Smelter Demon. Although Laurence must have taken me about 40 to 50 bloody attempts back on my first playthrough of the DLC, made more frustrating by the slightly shitty run back, I'm pretty damn solid at him now and managed to nail him first try here. It's definitely not just a blatant reuse of the Cleric beast either, because Laurence does have a unique second form where the lower half of his body explodes, so let's give Laurence some credit here. Also, he is totally optional, but the actual first boss of the DLC is most certainly not optional. It's Ludwig. God damn, this boss is tough. The DLC in general is very difficult, way harder than the base game, and that goes for both the bosses and the levels. But the level leading up to Ludwig is somewhat manageable even if you come here at a lower level. It's very tough and you might need to run past some stuff, especially these guys, but you're likely to hit your first brick fucking wall is this fella. This was one of those bosses that I felt really cocky about here for some reason, because there are certain really difficult bosses throughout FromSoft games that I've gotten good at over the years and can beat in 1 or 2 attempts, like Laurence, Fume Knight and Gale, and I thought Ludwig was also one of those until he killed me 10 times. It got to the point where I had to just switch the game off for an hour and try again later. I was getting too salty. But all the salt in the world can't detract from one of FromSoft's greatest creations, because Ludwig is a top tier boss, no doubt. Although we only see Ludwig for the first time here in the Hunter's Nightmare, we hear mention of him in item descriptions in the base game too, and even a couple of weapons are named after him, Ludwig's Holy Blade and his Holy Rifle. Just as Laurence was the first Vicar of the Healing Church, Ludwig was its first hunter, training up many other hunters to combat the Beast Scourge in the name of the church, until he became blood drunk like all the others, ending up in the Hunter's Nightmare and transforming into what is arguably the most hideous and ferocious beast in the game. Yet another very cool detail about this boss is that the whole river of blood stretching from here to the other side of the level was created by the blood of Ludwig's victims, hence the stacked piles of corpses at the sides of this bloody arena. Before the DLC came out, people assumed that Bloodborne's version of the Moonlight Blade was Ludwig's Holy Blade. Of course, the 3 previous Souls games feature this glowing blue sword, and then Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring would have their own iterations of it, though not Sekiro sadly. However, the transition cutscene into Ludwig's second phase is where we finally see Bloodborne's actual Moonlight Sword.
You were at my side all along. My true mentor, my guiding moonlight.
Honestly, back when I first saw this cutscene, I straight up got shivers. And then I realised I just left my window open, so I got up and shut it and continued to play the game. Seriously though, this boss was already one of the best even before Phase 2. Brutally difficult, yes, but incredible. But the way Ludwig turns from a wild beast biting and bucking to changing his stance up completely and using a sword with grace and dexterity is so fucking sick. I'm sure the last thing anyone expects here is for the boss to start speaking in a refined English accent. You can even have a productive chat with him afterwards. And get his Holy Moonlight Sword, which I of course started using immediately. It's a very cool weapon, but it's another one where its trick version only really imbues it with arcane damage, rather than transforming it entirely. Apparently FromSoft originally planned to release the Old Hunters as 2 separate DLCs, but then just decided to release it as one. This was definitely the right choice because while it's a good size for a DLC, and with 5 new bosses, if they'd split it up then you would have had 2 pieces of content which were too small. Still, the difference in nature between the 3 main levels of the DLC are massive, and whereas the twisted version of Yharnam we visit at the start is filled with beasts, hunters and a literal river of blood, the research hall looks and feels very different, and then the fishing hamlet which comes afterwards is the most unique of them all. Moving from one level to the next here never really feels jarring in a negative way either, because bear in mind that this is a nightmare with very different rules of reality. So when you later ascend the clock tower only to exit out into the fishing hamlet, it's more of a holy shit I love this moment than a holy shit this is dumb moment. The research hall is absolutely horrific, though in a compelling and enjoyable way. There were already several layers to Bloodborne's horror before the DLC, and the further you made it into the game, the more they were revealed. When you're roaming the smoky streets of Yharnam, you probably aren't expecting scenes like the Forbidden Woods or Yahar'gul, and certainly not the quiet cosmic horror of the upper Cathedral ward. But then yet another new layer is introduced with the Research Hall, presenting you with medical horror, for lack of a better term. As Simon tells us, this is the true face of the Healing Church. We know about the horrific eventual effects of blood ministration, but this is where we see the nature of their experiments on humans with water, causing patients' head to bloat up grotesquely. I assume towards the end goal of creating celestial emissaries or some other kind of kin to be used to commune with the Great Ones. As a result, you have scores of these tortured souls roaming around every floor of the Research Hall, in different forms too. Some with gowns on, some naked, some walking around without their heads, and some which don't even have bodies. This place is fucking horrific. The most disturbing of these creatures are the non-hostile ones you can actually speak to, including Saint Adeline with her questline requiring you to find and bring her brain fluid, attainable only from non-hostile disembodied heads, and culminating in this.
My guide, I see your voice, clearly as it bends and bleeds. My own revelation, just for me. Thank you for everything. Really, I used to be nothing.
Jesus. Well, at least we got a cool new rune from her. Let's try it on. Jesus. The boss of the area is the Living Failures, a fight against the Church's failed experiments in creating celestial emissaries, a process they later of course perfected. It's a largely unremarkable fight against their shared health pool, but their meteor attack is stunning. Anytime Bloodborne introduces cosmic or celestial imagery like this, I love it. It really complements the other, more brutal and bloody horror elements. The Living Failures are merely a precursor to the true boss of the Research Hall, however, because beyond the Sunflower Garden awaits Lady Maria of the Astral Clock Tower. Honestly, this was another fight I thought I was going to absolutely smoke, but again, I got wrecked, many times, and it's mainly due to our third phase. Like Gascoigne and Martyr Logarius, Maria is person-shaped, and so she can be staggered, and thank God too, otherwise this would probably be the single most challenging boss in the game. It'd be like fighting Black Flame Frida if she was immune to being staggered. Speaking of Frida, these fights are very similar, to the point where I've always thought she felt like a Bloodborne boss due to her crazy speed and combos. The main thing with Maria that always catches me out is her delayed attacks, because the wind-ups are so damn long and it makes you panic, and I can just never time it correctly. And in phase 3, she'll leave behind trails of fire and blood after every attack, giving her increased range as well as an additional hazard to watch out for even after dodging. Several patients in the Research Hall will call out to Maria by name, and she's implied in certain item descriptions to have been a somewhat empathetic figure here. As well as this, Maria was also one of the first hunters, originating from Cainhurst, then training under Gehrman and being the object of his affections. Clearly the reason why the doll was fashioned to resemble her appearance and share her voice, and if you return to the hunter's dream, after killing Maria, the doll will mention that she feels liberated somehow. The final area of the DLC which follows after defeating Lady Maria is the fishing hamlet, where the body of the Great One, Cause, first washed up on its shore before being violated by Byrgenwerth. Due to the anomalous nature of the appearance of the hamlet's inhabitants, the scholars at Byrgenwerth killed and dissected them in their relentless pursuit for knowledge, inspecting whether they'd grown eyes on the insides of their skulls as a result of their proximity and apparent worship of Cause. As well as what they did to the body of Cause, whatever that may have been, the Great One carried a child within it who Byrgenwerth also violated in some way, though the details around exactly what was done here are hazy. What we do know is that it was evil enough to result in an endless curse upon all hunters, creating this hunter's nightmare where they'd all be doomed to hunt endlessly amidst blood and beasts. The fishing hamlet is absolutely crawling with fishmen of various kinds, and of course this whole place is heavily influenced by Lovecraft's The Shadow over Innsmouth. Although these things individually really aren't that much of an issue, there are a lot of them, and coupled with their ability to chuck harpoons at you from range, even this first section of the level can be brutal to get through if you're not quite prepared. And I've even been known to run straight through it to the next hunter's lamp on occasion. Of course, it's not these wee guys who strike fear into my heart, it's these big guys, the most intimidating enemy in the whole game. Individually, they're very challenging, not least of all because of the intimidation factor of its voice and appearance, but I think the key to handling them well is to simply not shit yourself when you see and hear one. It's their crazy long wind-ups that make them so hard, because you just want to get the hell away from them whenever they start an attack. Of course, then you go down this well and there's two of the fucking things. But the secret here is to just use a shaman bone blade, causing one to attack the other, getting you the Rakuyo, the best skill weapon in the game, and one which belonged to Maria before she threw it down the well after being overcome with shame at Byrgenwerth's actions in the fishing hamlet. I mentioned back in my discussion on Insight that the mysterious pale slugs known as phantasms would come into play again in the DLC, and indeed they are everywhere here, particularly in this fishery where they cover the entire ground, indicating that they were important to the survival of the inhabitants of the hamlet long before Byrgenwerth became interested in their eldritch properties. From various points throughout the hamlet you actually get a clear view of the beach where the body of Cause lies, and indeed we reach the same shore at the end of the hamlet. The Orphan of Cause is quite possibly the hardest boss in the game, at least if you exclude some of the more outrageous shit found in the Chalice Dungeons. A cool detail though is that if you don't actually approach it, it will just continue staring off at the moon forever. It's only once we get closer to its mother's body that the boss aggroes against us. Orphan is extremely aggressive, has great range and does massive damage. However, just as with several other very challenging bosses in the game, it is fully vulnerable to staggers, both from guns and charged attacks. And so again, if you're good enough, you can end this fight surprisingly quickly. Regardless of this vulnerability, its second phase is meant to induce pure panic. You can easily go a damn minute without doing a single bit of damage, just through desperately trying not to get hit as it dashes around and leaps about. Again, it's totally vulnerable to staggers here too, but they're just so difficult to time that I often opted for dodging out of the way rather than risk messing up the shot and getting hit. Absolutely perfect final DLC boss though, and something that makes it even more memorable is the emotional aspect to it. Although it looks absolutely hideous, we're fighting an orphan here, or at least the nightmare version of it. And it's as if it's only fighting us out of rage for its mother's death at the hands of Byrgenwerth and the hunters, and our character is a hunter themselves, mind you. There also seems to be some bizarre connection to Gehrman here, as indicated by Orphan's sobs in the intro cutscene, which are the same as Gehrman's if you catch him speaking to himself in his sleep.
Please, anybody, I've had enough of this dream. The night blocks all sight. Oh, somebody, please.
Gehrman was one of the hunters present at the fishing hamlet along with Maria when the original atrocities occurred, but as for exactly what his connection to the orphan is, who knows, certainly not me. Just like when we defeated Mergo's wet nurse after beating the Orphan of Cause, as well as the shadow emanating from its mother's body, presumably meant to represent its actual self rather than the monstrous physical manifestation we just defeated, we again get the message Nightmare slain, and the horrific moon that was there before disappears completely from the nightmare at this point. We also get a weapon after the fight called the Cause Parasite, though it does absolutely nothing unless you equip the Milkweed Rune, activating the most bizarre weapon in the entire game. It's just a shame that you only get this thing at the end of the DLC though, because it means your only real chance of making use of it is in the New Game Plus. And that's the Old Hunters. Not only do I consider this the greatest Soulsborne DLC, but it's my favourite DLC from any game ever. It provided more insight and background into the history of the Healing Church, and Byrgenwerth gave the player way more trick weapons to use, and boasts 2 top tier Soulsborne bosses, or even make that 3 if you like, because I know a lot of people absolutely love the Maria fight, though I think the Ludwig fight in particular was something truly special, thanks in large part to that legendary face transition and the impossibly cool soundtrack. The DLC also does a lot to fill out the game somewhat, because Bloodborne can be surprisingly short if you know exactly where you're going, especially if you don't bother with the optional areas and bosses or the Chalice Dungeons. All that's left at this point is to face Gehrman, who is waiting at the foot of the tree, though not the Erd tree, just a regular tree. As I said earlier, you can just end the game here entirely if you want, without even having to fight him. But short of doing this for the PlayStation achievement, there's no reason to do this unless you want to miss out on one of the best fights in the game. In saying that though, Gehrman is certainly not a massive challenge if you've already beaten Maria, and indeed, he can also be staggered with gunshots, and indeed, thank fuck, or this fight would be so much harder. To be honest, I do think it's a bit too easy to stagger Gehrman, to the point where I sometimes had to resist the urge to do it and end the fight too early. Gehrman was absolute hell for me on my blood level 4 run though, because I actually had to get good at dodging his attacks instead of just being able to get hit and heal and then hit and heal. And if your level and skill stat are too low in Bloodborne, your critical attacks do absolute dog shit damage, regardless of how reinforced your weapon is. Beating Gehrman gets you the Old Hunter's badge, allowing you to purchase his weapon, the Burial Blade, but just as with the Cause Parasite, you get it rather late, so it's only really good for New Game Plus or maybe the Chalice Dungeons. Of course, the game is not yet over, because a great one known as the Moon Presence, the entity who had been keeping Gehrman prisoner here, descends down from above to embrace us, so that we may replace Gehrman, ourselves then being trapped in this hunter's dream and continuing on the cycle of nightmares with successive hunters. But if you've consumed at least 3 third umbilical cords, the Moon Presence is repelled by you, thus the true final boss begins. Although this is a cool boss with a great design, the Moon Presence is much easier than Gehrman, and thankfully FromSoft had not yet got into that whole thing of making the player fight the previous boss all over again upon death like they did in Sekiro and Elden Ring. It seems like there was possibly another phase or alternate version of the Moon Presence too, as indicated by folk digging into Bloodborne's vast and fascinating treasure trove of cut content, but the version we got has a far more refined appearance, and I've always thought that it looks somewhat feminine in a strange way. And once the Moon Presence has been defeated, once again for the third and final time, we get the message Nightmare Slain, indicating something is different here and the cycle has been broken by our actions.
Are you cold? Oh, good hunter.
And that, folks, is Bloodborne. This ending implies that as a result of consuming the 3 third umbilical cords and defeating the Moon Presence, we've been reborn as a Great One. As for what that would entail, who knows? I am of the opinion that Bloodborne is FromSoft's greatest achievement. It may not have had quite the effect on the industry that Dark Souls did, or sell as many copies as Elden Ring, but the tightness and speed of the combat mechanics, the deliciously dark setting, the stellar soundtrack, the complex and layered horror elements, the outstanding voice acting, and all the countless other smaller elements of Bloodborne's brilliance add up to one of the greatest games of all time, and in my opinion, the greatest of all the Soulsborne games. Whenever I finish a playthrough, I just want to get straight back in and play through the whole thing all over again, to re-experience the polished level design of Central Yharnam, and the lurid horror of Yahar'gul, and every other incredible level, boss, and piece of dialogue the game has to offer. I guess one of the most unfortunate aspects of the game is that it's stuck on the PS4, and despite the repeated emergencies of the rumours of a PC release or a sequel, 8.5 years on, they're still no closer to that being a reality. I've even heard rumours of a remake, but frankly that would be ridiculous. There was a case for a remake for Demon Souls, but all Bloodborne really needs is a remaster in 60 FPS. Don't waste time remaking the fucking thing. In saying that though, I'd still play a remake, obviously. But folks, I think that's as good a place as any to end this thing. I sincerely hope you enjoyed the video, and as always, cheers for watching and cheerio.